Are you on the screen or what?
I'm on a little bit of both right now.
Oh. I've gotten, just looking at this outline notes to begin with the bibliography, it's going to over a couple of things. One, again, it's important to have an introduction to the Old Testament if you don't have one. It will give you, and Harrison is very good on giving you an introduction to the prophets. In that regard, I also have, though I don't have it on here, I should have put it on here, the introduction to the prophets. That is the name of the book, To the Prophets. That is by, all of a sudden I forgot his name. Doesn't come out very much, does it? Well, I'll try to remember it and bring that to you at some point. He's kind of a tragic figure, as a matter of fact. The individual who wrote the book and ultimately committed suicide. But he did a very good job on the introduction to the prophets. He was involved in one of those churches that have the belief that you don't take your children wherever the doctors, and heal them. The whole thing is kind of a tragic life of sorts, but he did a very good job on the prophets, book of the prophets. In fact, he was a professor, if I believe, at Grace Seminary at one point in Norman Lake. I can't remember the name. It was a good book. I mean, I had to remember to put the book here, but I didn't. So, forgetful professors. But at any rate, on this bibliography, we have our textbook here, Sandy and Geese. Sandy and Geese. Also, I have down here 2 books by Westermann, Klaus Westermann. Basic Forms of Prophetic Speech and Prophetic Oracles of Salvation in the Old Testament. It will deal with such issues as announcements of salvation, as it's in our textbook here, oracles, which is called Oracles of Salvation, and then announcements of judgment. Those are all in the prophetic vein, if you will. Okay? He doesn't break down his book with a study of the prophets per se, as prophetic literature per se, but what I'm saying is that the Oracles of Salvation and the chapter on announcements of judgment are prophetic genre, if you will. Okay? Of course, apocalyptic could be thrown in there as well, and we'll talk about that briefly. Okay? But to begin with, I just want to mention these 2 chapters. We'll go through those at a point during this discussion of the prophetic literature. Okay? Not right at this very moment. Description and exegetical perspectives. My notes here aren't all that extensive, so our textbooks are very good. But the more important aspects is going to be when we actually get into some of it, such as Haggai, just as an illustration and example of how it works out and how we understand it. Okay? So, in the description and exegetical perspectives notes, I note that there are many different speech forms that occur, and you can see some of those forms, for instance, in form criticism of the Old Testament, or more particularly, Old Testament form criticism by Hayes up there. We'll get into that more specifically. Okay? For instance, there are lawsuit speeches. Well, actually, when he deals in this book with law, sometimes at some point he will mention such things as lawsuit kind of discussions or speeches, and that's part of the prophetic genre as well. So there's lawsuit speeches, there are prophetic announcements of, as we said, of judgment and of salvation. There are prophetic. Ezekiel has a number of prophetic, we wouldn't call them speeches, I guess, but where he portrays prophetic events as he lays down naked and starving, a picture of Jerusalem, X number of days on one side, X number of days on the other side, or when he cuts his hair and throws it to the wind, third part to the wind, etc. It burns the third part. It shows playing out, acting out the prophetic things. So that's part of it as well. We won't go into all those details. Okay? Generally speaking, these two types of messages, and this is the broad and general picture, and that's where most of it occurs, and therefore that's why we're focusing on these two broad aspects, the positive and the negative. Okay? The announcements of salvation, what she calls oracles of salvation here, just as a basic breakdown, and there are variations, of course, formal elements, an indication of the situation, introduced oftentimes by some causal form. Here's two of them that I've given. For example, Ya'an or Asher. Okay, we may use other words, may simply use he, but the point is that it's going to indicate what the situation is that requires some sort of salvation, some sort of deliverance, if you will. Okay. And the prediction of salvation or deliverance may be a negative sense, may be introduced by Hineni, behold me, I am doing such and such, okay, or I will do. Normally the reason for the announcement will be some aspect of God's loving kindness or hesed, some His faithful, covenant faithfulness, some translate that term, interpret that term. Okay. It may not be, that word itself may not be there, but it's always related somehow to God's covenant faithfulness. And by the way, mentioning covenant should also remind us of the fact that the issues here are covenant related. That is often in the Old Testament here, Mosaic covenant related. Okay. Then a concluding characterization, if you will, for the therefore, like Cain's word, and maybe this thus says the Lord that occurs, right, throughout. We'll see a couple of places where that occurs. So those are kind of formal elements that are involved, but obviously in real life, you may have a form, but all aspects of the form aren't necessarily always utilized. It's not a form that gets superimposed at every point where you got to use all the bits and pieces in the exact way in which the form critics say they developed. In real life, it changes. You may have a real extensive indication of the situation, or you may just simply have a word or a phrase or maybe one verse. But then the prediction of salvation may be very limited or it may be very extensive, right? Or sometimes the indication of the situation won't even be there because it's in the background. It's obvious, I mean, you've been beat up, you've been destroyed by a foreign power. You don't have to explain all of that. So you go into the prediction of deliverance may occur. Okay. So that's the announcements of salvation. We'll go into that some. And then the announcements of, judgment. Forget what I have here. I'll have to open that up. See what we're going to put there. Oh, Haggai. I'm going to be getting into Haggai, of course. So, I don't know what I got here. Oh, there it is. Okay. Getting into Haggai and illustration later on. Now, the judgment speech is involved, of course, an introduction of some sort, and then an accusation. Normally, of course, the legal covenantal issue that will occur. often includes a statement, not always, but often the woe statements, okay? Woe to those who, and then it describes some aberration from the covenant norms, okay? It could be a question or a statement, because you did such and such, or, should you be acting like this? Question, And then the announcement. So there's the introduction, the accusation, the announcement. Thus said the Lord, occurs again, very common. Could be in the first person, God talking, I will do such and such to you, and because of this. And the verdict. Could be in the third person, this will happen. Okay? So that's how that oftentimes plays out. Again, variations to the form, but usually all of the aspects will be somewhere there, so that there's no question as to why we're being judged. Okay? They know why they're going to be judged because it's going to be stated somehow or indicated. Okay? Notice how it works out in this Micah passage. I'll come to this part later. There's an introduction which he says, woe. Okay? Then there's an accusation, devisers of iniquity and doers of evil upon your beds. And then you develop that. And as it continues on, that's a development of the accusation. And they desire fields, and they steal them and take away houses, and oppress a man and his household, a man and his inheritance. Okay? All that's kind of a development off of the accusation. Workers, doers of iniquity. Okay? So that could be developed in either long or short form. And then the messenger formula, therefore, see that about Cain crops up there, therefore, you very often want to make note of that. Therefore, thus says Yahweh. Okay, now we're going to get into it here, looks like. Behold, I am an intervention of God with his statement. I am devising against his family an evil or a misfortune, which you will not be able to remove your necks from, and you will not walk proudly, because it is a time of evil or misfortune. I am bringing trouble upon you. And the results of the intervention. On that day, one will raise against you a proverb and lament with lamentation. You are completely ruined. He alters the portion. My people, how does he remove it from me? He divides our fields for the backslidden. And he's not asking a question, it's a statement of declaration more than a question in that exercise. Well, Micah is where that is, and I went from one of the books. I'll explain which one it's in a minute. So is this, how it breaks it out. See, this is, I'm going to make that a little smaller, I guess. This comes from Vesserman's book. There's charts. Okay? There are charts in the book that don't go through all of them, but a number of them where he breaks down the form and shows you various texts where this form is being played out, if you will. Okay? Here he's got one from Amos, which has introduction, accusation, development, messenger, formula, and invention of God. It's got the whole form there. Okay? Passage in Isaiah here, in Isaiah 30, where the introduction aspects are not there, but the accusation is there, right? In the Micah passage over here, he doesn't have a messenger formula, but it certainly shows how God is going to intervene, and what's ultimately going to happen is not there either. It's left for him to figure out. When he says how God intervenes, you don't have to say what the results of that's going to be. You'll cry out to the Lord, he will not answer them, he will hide his face from them. Right? Apparently doesn't need to express the results of that. It's going to be said more obvious. Okay? But here's our passage. Let's see. What was it? Oh, Micah 2. Micah 2:1-4. So the introduction is just simply, oh, woe, and I've already brought the or translator give a translation of this accusation and development for you there, messenger formula, and then the intervention and the results. We'll explain it all. But notice then he also has this form, breaks it down for Micah, section in Micah where he has everything except the intervention, therefore, but he just moves from the messenger formula to the results, which obviously God is, going to be involved with this, so that you stated there. Therefore, because of you, Zion shall be plowed as a field, Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins, and the mountain without of a wooded height. Okay, a wooded height, which is to say, implies, of course, this is all going to be because God judged us. You don't have to state it, apparently, you see. Here in Jeremiah, example, the introduction is pretty long. Here, as for you, don't pray for this people or lift up a cry of prayer for them, and do not intercede with me, for I do not hear you. That's a pretty lengthy introduction, but it represents an introduction to it. And then the accusation, do you not see what they are doing in the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem? And then the development, well, yeah, it's just a question, but notice the development is the specifics. And the children gather wood, the fathers kindle fire, the women need dough to make cakes for the queen of heaven. There's an accusation specifically, isn't it, in the development. The queen of heaven, that's idolatry going on. They pour out drink offerings to other gods that won't meet anger. Right? So there's that development and the accusations embedded together, really, isn't it? And the messenger formula there where it says, the Lord, behold, intervention, my anger and my wrath will be poured out upon man, beast, trees, everything, and the results of that will burn and not be quenched. It's going to be over. And get terrible judgment after it, right? So that's a pretty good breakdown by Westermine. Of course, you just don't want the chart. You want to read how he explains all the aspects of the judgment theme there. Okay? So that's generally, except for our exercise from Haggai that I want to develop for us after we read it and translate it. But that's all I've got on the notes as far as the 2 chapters that he develops. We want to talk about that before we walk through that and talk about that before we develop the illustration from Haggai in that fashion. Okay? So let us spend a little bit of time walking through our textbook. Okay? Oracles of salvation. He starts with the good stuff instead of the bad stuff. In the Old Testament, it's usually reversed. It's the bad stuff that comes up first, and then the good stuff. Right? So, I turn to page 139 of this chapter, and let me ask you first, before I start talking, right? What comments that you may have in reading that chapter? And I'm making an assumption. I hope it's not a false assumption that you read the chapter. Anything that you may want to bring out there before we walk through the chapter? Anything?
I guess, how do we, maybe this is too big a question, but how do we sort out which aspects of the salvation relate to them temporarily being either in exile or oppressed by various countries, and how those maybe relate to bigger things, such as, I guess these aren't really oracles of salvation, but the one that jumps to my mind is where in Ezekiel and Isaiah where they're prophesying against certain kings, and those are taken to be references to Satan. maybe this isn't necessarily the right section, but that's one of my biggest questions about prophecies. How do we know that those aren't just...
How do we know that we're not talking about
just
King of Babylon, but we're talking about Satan?
Mm-hmm.
Well, when you get into the details of those, that's where the proof or disproof is going to have to be discovered, right? The details of that. But there's also a sense in which the prophet will utilize a very literal and contemporary person or group, like, well, take the kingdom of Tyre, for instance. It's obvious as he begins to develop and make statements about the kingdom of Tyre that as you examine that in comparison to the historical and contemporary individual or the country, it relates there, but it goes beyond there. In other words, if you take the imagery that's involved and look at it, it tends to go beyond the personages themselves. King of Tyre, King of Babylon, right? So you get a feel that we're moving away from the historical personage here, contemporary person, to something that goes beyond that and somebody that goes beyond that. But that's discoverable in the details, I would think. When we get to the point where the details say this Jesus can't be the king of Babylon here, right? Or the king of Tyre, then you have to recognize that he's extended beyond, or at least the Holy Spirit has, right? Mm-hmm. Taken this and applied it broader than simply that one individual.
Okay. And then with the oracles of salvation, we would do maybe kind of the same thing.
Similar kind of a thing occurs, yeah.
But
now it's going to be very clear at certain points that he's dealing with, okay, if you do this, this will happen. Okay. But then there are some places, like in Isaiah 53, just to take the obvious example, some of that goes really goes beyond the people at that point of time, a particular event. Right? When you take Isaiah 14 or Isaiah 9, the messianic prophecies that occur within that, obviously they go beyond Isaiah's time frame somewhere along the line. And where you make the division between the contemporary, which breaks out into the future, see, sometimes that's a little vague. Okay? But that's where the details, the more details that you observe in the text by getting closer and closer to it, by doing the hard work, the sometimes tedious work of analysis, right, will point out, extract details that give indication that we're beyond the contemporary scene here. Or the fact that there's an extension, a legitimate extension that can be seen from this way in which it develops. Okay? Can be extended. In other words, I've got a technical terminology I was thinking about, but couldn't formulate in my mind. The prophetic, I wish I could remember the technical terminology. It's too long of a day, too many meetings. You can immediately bring out the technical terms. The idea that certain prophecies are singular on the one hand, that is only refer to one event, one time and place, as some would say, and also then have different dimensions that the prophet may not himself been aware of, which then extend off into the future. Which I can't remember my terminology for there right on hand. I apologize for that. Maybe it'll come to me as we move forward. So, but I would say to you that the key to some of these questions is not by looking at broad pictures, but by getting all the data out from the details and not ignoring that. Okay? Some people get in trouble, can't figure it out because they don't interact with the narrow, defined details. Well, I don't know if that helps you not. Anything else about in this section that you would like to interact with briefly before I walk through it for you and point out some things that seem the significant things that for me come out? All right. Well, let me look at on page. Just a couple of statements were made on the first page, 139. In the set paragraph, simple paragraph, beginning of the paragraph. One facet of salvation is promise. Or put it another way, I suppose, when we're talking about salvation, oracles of salvation, we're not using that term in the soteriological sense of, going to heaven, so to speak. Okay? Often the concept is very often just simply the broad idea of deliverance, and that's a better term probably to use because it can apply both to temporal and eternal values, right? Issues. So there's probably a problem just with the word salvation that often gets used, which may not be the best term to use. Anyway, he says one aspect or factor of that, or facet of that, is promise. And then the other, on page 140, he uses another term. God, in the first full paragraph, God is also the source of blessing. That this facet of salvation assures his creatures of vitality and well-being. So what he's talking about with salvation, oracles of salvation sometimes are those blessing terms that would occur in the covenant. Remember the blessings opposed to the cursings? Okay, so deliverance, for instance, of a judgment from God of let's say, national judgment of occupation by a foreign power, that's a curse. But the blessing is deliverance from the foreign power. So, and that would be then could occur, does occur in an oracle of salvation. Deliverance in that sense. At the bottom of the page, he kind of tries to sum this up a bit, I think, on 141. Oracles, God's direct statements to his people, last paragraph. Found throughout the Old Testament, oracles address individuals in a specific and present need. That's important. Otherwise, you don't understand the prophets. You think of the prophets as only futuristic stuff. That's really not even the primary thing. Oracles address individuals in a specific and present need, comfort them with the message of God's presence, and promise deliverance in the future. This is the essential background of the message of the prophets. Understanding the prophets come on the scene because of the situation of the people's relationship to God in the present. And so he brings about God's statements of judgment, which are more often than not simply a restatement of what God said he would do in the covenant. Don't use all those terms that grow out of Exodus or Deuteronomy often. But he brings about the judgment that occurs that God said would happen. Okay? So he's saying you sinned and therefore this is a judgment. But then growing out of that comes the blessing side of that. That is, when God said if you respond, here are the blessings. Well, so he talks about the blessing side, which is the oracle of salvation, right? So that's the positive stuff that comes out. And sometimes it's immediate. That is, you have famine, so now you're going to have good crops, right? And sometimes it goes beyond the immediate to the future, way beyond the prophet's time frame. And that's where your problem again occurs. You've got to define where that occurs. As in Joel, for instance, it's just talking about a famine in the land that is going to be resolved, or in fact, are we leaping at some point, leaping off into the day of the Lord of the future? And that's the big issue we go, of course, the day of the Lord, and all those issues. Is this locust plague a real plague? And is it related to a real contemporary event? Well, I would think you'd have to say on one hand, certainly it starts from there, but does it end there? After the contemporary drought is over, is there anything about that sends us off into the future? Similar kind of things happening in the future. I think you have to say yes, ultimately, but they define when and where that occurs in the text is not always the easiest thing to do. Okay, so that makes it a little difficult for the prophets. Okay, so at any rate, what makes oracle salvation unique? Well, he mentions that obvious statement in the second sentence there. The prophets are couched in a new context of the oracle of judgment. So, in other words, because of judgment, there's a need for these salvation statements to come about. Okay, so one relates to the other. The last statement on the next page, the last statement of that first full paragraph. True prophets of God both afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. Right? That's their role. In a nutshell, that's kind of their role. They're comfortable in their sin, they get afflicted by the prophet. Right? And then he comforts them after he berates them and tells them about terrible things that are going to happen. Or, in Jeremiah's case, relating to the terrible things that have already happened. Okay? But then giving them comfort about the future promises of God. Okay? And so we've got what is called, when we already talked about some of this, related a little differently than the way in which I broke it down, but the messenger formula, what God says, thus says the Lord, etc. And in a word of salvation, the announcement of the blessing of God has going to come. Okay? So the function of oracles of salvation at the end of 42 as a prophetic jump is to offer reassurance that faithful God hears and to affirm that God is committed to His promises. And that's the key, committed to His promises. Where were the promises? They were in the covenant. Okay? That's where it's at. Okay. We won't necessarily relate that part any further. All the subgenres and everything we get in there, we won't get in there, you've read it or will read it. Where they're found, we're going to talk first of all where they're found in the ancient Near East. And then he gets into the biblical, where they're found in the biblical part, biblical data on page 146. Okay? The prophets address the people at large, whereas the extra-biblical parallels pronounce oracles to individuals or kings. Okay, so further, the oracle of salvation are unique development in Israel, and that the prophetic message is not only grounded in common heritage, but are integrally related to each other. That is, the people are not only have a connection nationally or with the covenant, but in that very fact, they are also bound to one another because of that individually. So, then we've got them in the canonical writings. That's what we're essentially getting to here. The prophetic corpus. Okay? Related organically and canonically to the law and to the writings. How to interpret. Here's what we need to focus. Okay. One, Be sensitive to the prophetic imagery. Is there any imagery in this stuff? It's not going to be right on it. It's not going to be right laid out real easy. No, it's not. Okay? There's an awful lot of imagery that's involved in this, right? So that part of the difficulty, doing the tough work of analyzing, not only the words, phrases, but the relationships, and then the images which occur all the time. Okay, so that's tough. Okay, so don't ignore that. At the same token, don't go crazy over it either. Okay, making the whole message a message of images. I mean, the imagery is there for it to have and the purpose of an image is not just to, think in terms of wild things, okay, but behind it, related to the image, is a very real, concrete idea that is being communicated, of course. Secondly, relate the assurance of the promises, blessings to the God's previous commitments made to creation, Adam, Moses, and David. And more often than not, it's going to be in the writing prophets, it's going to be related to the Mosaic covenant. Okay? Sometimes it could be related to, let's say, the Davidic promise. Okay, that's true. Sometimes maybe the Abrahamic covenant with respect to the people. Yes, okay, that's true. But more often you can tie it into the covenant. Mosaic covenant in the Old Testament. Okay. Thirdly, on page 148, examine the dual background of the exile and restoration of the exiles to the land. Some of these prophets occur, these statements occur prior to, the captivity at home. Others occur after that. Haggai occurs when? Before or after the exile? Remember? Any idea? Haggai after. Okay, it's a post-exilic prophet. Haggai. So, background of exile and restoration. Now, in relating to post-exilic prophets, see, in the background of that has been a sinful nation. That's why they went into exile to begin with, right? And now, so they may not mention all of that stuff that happened before, right? But it's in the background, it's in the minds, and everybody recognizes that. The prophet as well as the hearers and readers of this. Okay. We sometimes forget that, and it could be something in there that is a reminder of why they had the problem to begin with. That's not on the surface. Okay. So we got to keep that in mind. Interpret the prophetic oracles from the perspective of transformation. Okay. What does he mean by transformation? Okay. What does that mean? Again? Go ahead.
Well, it says the people will once again be humble, faithful, and spirit-filled. And if we're connecting the salvation to the judgment is coming from the sin, and the salvation is going to accompany a repentance or transformation of that sort.
Okay. Or, put it another way, there has been a backsliding, if you will, and a sinful way of life that brought about the exile, right? And the people, the whole nation needs to be transformed, if you will, from their position of sin and rebellion into the position of obedience and a new era, right? A new world, in fact, and post-exilic, right? Yeah, another land. In fact, for most of those people, most of the people who come back to the land had never been there before, because they were born in exile, right? 70 years in Babylon. How many of those who went in captivity lived through it all and came back? Well, number one, most of them were too old to come back, and a lot of them died, and a lot of people were born, and those people have never been to the land, right? And so they're coming at 30, 40 years old, right? 50 years old, maybe even. Could be even 60, I suppose. If not, maybe even small. But at any rate, so there's a whole newness about the whole thing, a new transformation. Yeah, right. The people the old land becomes new to all these people, and so we have a new world, if you will, and everybody needs to change and get back to what the original obedience of God to God was before they were disobedient and went back into the exile. Okay, 5. Understand the fulfillment oracles as a process. That's pretty interesting idea, right? In other words, it doesn't always happen immediately. This whole business of transformation doesn't happen immediately anyway. So there's going to be a process of reestablishment, let's say, in the land. But even judgment or salvation issues that occurred prior to the exile, going on during Isaiah's day and whatever. There was a process that was involved in bringing people back into line here. And part of the process is the activity of the prophets. Because their role, you see, was not just simply to condemn these people, throw rocks at them and say, God's going to get you. No, their role was to try to straighten them up so that they don't end up in terrible judgment. And that's a part of the process. And obviously, salvation, the statements of salvation that affect the near future and extending off into the farther future is obviously one of the elements of that is simple time, right? And so we can't expect everything that's promised in this statements of deliverance to occur even in the lifetime of the prophet. Right? Or in the lifetime of the people he's talking to. Okay? Fulfillment has many stages, he said, and each stage is related to the progress of redemption. And he illustrates it just like a flow of a river and its constancy of movement. And then 6, ask what response the prophet was eliciting. What was he trying to get him to do? Well, a lot of times in the prophets we don't have much said about how the people responded. In Jeremiah, for instance, we get some of that. They don't like what he said, they threw him into a hole. He wrote a book and they tore up the book. That's pretty obvious responses there. But many of it we don't get. We don't know what they responded, how they responded. But at the same token, we can get a feel for what the response the prophet was trying to get from them. And that again is in the details. It's not just in the broad sweep of it. It's in the details. So reflecting upon that.
And I think the response that he's trying to get out of them is probably where to preach too, in a sense.
Yeah, that's true.
He's got an application he's looking for.
That's right. Mm-hmm. That's right, and that would be a good place to kind of focus our, as we try to make it relevant. Okay? We got to transfer, again, this is a touchy problem of taking the Old Testament accusation, which is related to covenant, which we in our church is not related to covenant, right?
Not that covenant.
That covenant, right, not that covenant. And so the specifics of the accusation may not be applicable because we don't do things like that, right? But the principle or the basis, underlying principle of that specific infraction, if you will, undoubtedly is transferable. Well, idolatry is one of the reasons, not the main reason why they ultimately went into captivity. Well, that idolatry meant bowing down to idols, wooden idols and other idols, and putting your children through the fire and everything else. Well, they didn't do that in New Testament times that I'm aware of, right? But was idolatry? Yeah, but idolatry has now transformed itself into a different mode. And now the mode of the New Testament idolatry, let's say going to the prostitutes in the temple for worship, right, is not today's mode of idolatry. But there is an idolatry today, right?
Celebrity, I would say.
What?
Celebrity.
Celebrity? Okay, could well be. But the point is, then, there's a transfer that takes place, but it's not with the specifics. As we talked about last time, this whole business of covenant is relationship. The bits and pieces that relate to it, they can change, and the relationship is still the primary issue. Okay, well, then finally, look for the complete fulfillment of the oracle of salvation in the coming of Jesus. Well, I would say yes, but there's more to it than that. In other words, I would have a little cautionary element at that point and say, well, not every promise, not everything the prophet's going to say that could come about has Christological dimensions to it. It could be something as simple as in Malachi. You robbed God by didn't give your tithes and offerings. Okay. Telling you, here's the promise. You give your tithes and offerings, and I'll open the windows of heaven, and you'll have great prosperity. Right? Well, that doesn't relate. That specifics of that doesn't relate to the Christian age, if you will, the age of the church, to this dispensation. Okay, the specifics of that doesn't relate to this dispensation. And so I would say that in itself, that specifics ended with the birth of the church. Okay. That doesn't mean there's no applicable aspects to that, certainly. But those specifics ended. Okay. Or, just the concept of God destroying or allowing Syria to be destroyed if they were worried about at one point. So don't worry about them. Isaiah chapter 7, don't worry about them. Within space of, I think it's somewhere around 2 years before this child knows to say, Daddy and Mommy, they'll be gone. Those kings you worried about are gone. There's no, in that specifics there is no extension out to Jesus. Right? Now there is in the Isaiah 7:14, which is a part of that. Well, that extends out, in my view. Right? But certainly some of the other aspects don't. Of the promise, if you will. So, just a little cautionary on what I'm saying. Okay. Anything further on that chapter? Westermann is listed here as well, but Van Gemeren has some good books on this topic as well. I would highlight those. Announcements of judgment. This is where we typically have a hard time, our people typically have a hard time reading the Bible through. Because when it comes to the prophets, the writing prophets, this is nothing but nasty stuff. I mean, they're always angry. And of course, they have difficulties of imagery and everything else, and then reflecting upon things that the people, original readers and hearers, would recognize to be background, but we don't, it's not on the surface, so it just kind of over the head, it's gone. So they just can't manage them at all. Okay? But I think this is where we can help our people out when we point them out to the fact that, look, when we have when the prophet is giving a judgment, it's based on something very specific. And we can point them to the specifics in the law. So make these correlations. Okay? And if we do that for them through that, they can get much more interested and see the cohesiveness of the prophets as it relates to the rest of the Old Testament. They oftentimes don't see that. Okay? So, God's prophet states an impossible task: make God's chosen people believe God will judge, discipline, and punish them. That's only part of the task, actually. The other part of the task is to try to get them to repent. Get on the right track. Okay, so that's the introduction there. How the prophets proclaim the message. Well, there are various ways. They didn't always speak the message. Sometimes they used, as Ezekiel particularly, he used dramatic means of communicating. Let's notice on page 159, this third paragraph, study of prophetic speeches has developed from one of two approaches. The prophets are seen as issuing threats and reproaches, or they are seen to issue announcements of judgment and reasons for it. Okay. Well, actually, they are doing both of those things. The problem that the issue is getting at is where the emphasis is placed. And, for instance, Gunkel would put the emphasis upon the threats and reproaches, where Westermann would put the emphasis upon the reasons, the lies, and then also Westermann, the extension of that would be repentance and blessing that grows out of it. Okay? Well, anyway, that's just two different things. On how announcement of judgments function, here I already listed this in part. Okay. There's two parts he notices: accusation and announcement. Westermann gets a little more defined on that, but it's there. Thus saith the messenger. You have commissioning. Well, in this case, commissioning simply means, as we see in Haggai, we see at the very beginning of Haggai, where the Lord came to Haggai the prophet, and he was supposed to talk to the people. Right? That's commissioning. Messenger formula, thus saith the Lord. Accusation, you blew it. You killed and taken possession, robbed and steal. Announcements of judgment. Okay, I'm going to get you. And then, that's just one example. Overall example. No, example from 1 Kings. Yeah. Okay. Important statements on 162 at the top. The judgment speech assumes the individual has violated the law in which the covenant between God and the people rested. That's key. It is God's way of carrying out normal judicial procedure against a king who seems to stand above such procedure and has no person to institute the legal process against him. So it's a formal issue, and as a matter of fact, some of them are very formal. Isaiah chapter 1 is actually a court scene. God is the judge and prosecuting attorney. The people are the defendants, and they're asked to present their case. Not a lot they can say. Okay. You see in the third paragraph there some of the specifics as to how these are indicated, the on or the aster or whatever. I won't go into that. Sometimes it's just simply key. Okay. The prophetic lawsuit is a part of the judgments. It's a subcategory what we classify as announcements of judgment. Prophetic lawsuit is a judgments. And this is where I mentioned before, where it's a court. It's a court scene. Okay? Whereas in the court scene, you've got an introduction or calling the audience to hear, and we'll get to that by illustrating it maybe from Isaiah 1. Questioning of witnesses, statement of the accusation, the prosecuting attorney addresses the court, description of the inability the cultic thing to atone for, and in the morning call back. Okay? That's a pretty well defined in Isaiah chapter 1. So he describes that stuff a little bit. Where they're found, well, we won't get into extra biblical stuff there. And most of it is found, obviously, in the writing prophets. But you see some of these in speaking prophets. When Elijah approaches the king, tell him what he did wrong. Guideline for interpretation, 166. Announcement of judgment came in a specific historical situation based on a specific word from God. This next is for you. No preacher is free to preach absolute judgment to a people without a similar experience with God. I'm not so sure. I know what he's saying here, but I think we can preach absolute judgment on let's say, an adulterer without having been an adulterer and then got the specific judgment from God ourselves. So I know what he's saying, this could be taken wrong here. But the key to that point is there's a specific historical situation. We'll try to tie into the specifics with it. Verse number 2, announcement of judgment rested on firm historical evidence that God's people had developed a lifestyle of ignored and broke a people's covenant commitments. There's that word again, covenant. Okay. Number 3, announcements of judgment result in widely differing responses. Yeah, they did. Sometimes they repented, as in Jonah's experience with Nineveh. Sometimes they didn't like what they heard, and they said, "Get out of town to Amos." Okay, don't come back here. Or they took Jeremiah and threw him in a hole, burned up his book. Okay. So there's different kind of responses that occurred. And that's, again, raised to the historical setting. Announcement of judgment, number 4, does not try to get something out of people to benefit the preacher or the congregation. It's almost comical to me, the way it states there, but we want you to act right. Here's a good illustration of what I think he's trying to get at. You people need to, let's just use a common illustration. You people need to tithe, okay? But in the back of his mind is, we've got a real budget problem. We've got to get these people to tithe so our budget can be met. You know what I'm saying? We're more concerned, they're not going to say that, of course. We're more concerned about our budget than anything else. That's why we got the stewardship members here. Instead of saying the real issue should be, you people need to relate properly to God with the finances, and that's our biggest concern. Right? But we have to try to keep that perspective in mind. Announcements of judgment in itself brings the hearers under judgment. Just the hearing of it. Announcements of judgment does not entrap God. What do we mean by that? Good illustration.
God's free to renege on the promise of judgment if they repent.
Yeah, well, we take Jonah, for example, right? And Jonah was all upset because why?
Because he did that.
Because he did it. Yeah, right. So, it doesn't entrap God. Announcements of judgment is only a part of the prophetic message, and indeed the introductory part. Okay? So, repentance, and then the good news comes after that. Okay? Notice, just as Jeremiah, notice the breakout of certain things. Notice at the body, Indication of situation introduced by an interrogative. See that? In other words, we're looking for little syntactical keys somehow to break out these forms. Okay? There's one right there. How about the prediction of disaster? La came. Very common phrase. La came, therefore. Okay? Or the concluding characterization, he, because, maybe I'll share, something like that. You see. Those are the syntactical things that we're oftentimes looking for to help us, to get it, to see exactly what part of the speech it is, and therefore what the focus of it is supposed to be. See. It's a good way to outline it, actually. Well, that's all I need to say on that, unless you have any comments.
Alrighty. In the second year, for Darius the king, in the 6th month, in the first day of the month, the word of Yahweh came by the hand of Haggai, the prophet, to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest, saying,
that part would represent that introductory aspect. Okay.
Saying, thus says Yahweh of hosts, this people this people says that the time has not yet come for the house of Yahweh to be rebuilt. And then the word of Yahweh.
Okay, that section there represents some sort of a statement of accusation, doesn't it?
Well, it seems like there's two of the sections in there, isn't there?
Well, yeah, it's going to go back and forth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because there's the thus says the Lord part
right.
of
right.
the accusation.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So the word of Yahweh came by the hand of Haggai the prophet, saying, Is it time for you yourselves to live in your paneled houses, and this house is desolate?
Right. Now that would be, that both 2 through 4 would be your representation of your first judgment statement or accusation. Yeah. Okay. And the first part is what they said. I said, Lord, you say. And then the second part of that is the response, if you will, of what God says about what they say. Right?
And now, or therefore, the Lord of hosts says, set your hearts upon your ways.
Okay.
You sow much and reap little. Eating and not satisfied, You drink and are not drunk. You're clothed but not warm. And well, this is the wage earner.
Yeah, right.
The wage earner earns wages for a purse with holes.
Okay, that's right now. Just go back, look at a little bit on that. Now when it says, now, let's say, Lord of hosts, consider your ways, set your heart on your ways. Actually, this is one of those instances here where you can see very clearly that through the prophet, God is looking for a response. I mean, He doesn't want to just bring judgment on His people. And so that's one instance where it's absolutely clear what He's looking for a change or repentance. He doesn't want a judgment if possible, although they're already experiencing judgment. Because the way you translated 6 was you sow much. Well, actually, that could be translated, probably better translated, as since it has a perfect as a historical statement. You sowed much, right? And brought in little. And those infinitive absolutes then follow suit in time with that main verb that kicked it off there. You sowed much, brought in little, eat, eaten not enough to satisfy you, drinking not enough to get drunk, clothe yourself but you're not warm. You know, and the wage earner earns wages through, he earns wages and puts it in a bag and it falls out the bottom. So they're experiencing already some level of judgment there. And then again, as he begins the next verse 7, so he's going back again to this to repetition there, in which obviously, and that's going to happen a few times throughout this whole book, he's really looking for a change, not just to bring judgment. Okay, go ahead.
Alrighty. Therefore, Yahweh of hosts says, set your hearts upon your ways. Go up to the hills and just lost my place. There we go. Go up to the hills and bring wood and build the house. And
Pleasure. Please.
what's that?
Take pleasure, be pleased.
Oh, yeah. And I will be pleased with it, and I will be glorified. Says Yahweh.
Yeah, right. Stop there for a second. Now there becomes the ultimate issue, isn't it, in this business of the house? So what's the big deal? Well, they're not glorifying God, they're not honoring Him, right? The relationship is kind of tenuous here because He's not pleased at the present situation, right? As he moves on, he's going to repeat in a little different format of what you've already said. Or the accusation or the statement of judgment that he already said is going to be somewhat repeated with little different words. Go ahead with that.
This is Yahweh. I remember that one.
What term?
No, final.
Huh?
Pano? Oh, that was
to turn.
to turn.
Turn towards something.
Yeah, it seemed like the translation said you look or you search.
Yeah.
Is that idiomatic or?
Yeah, kind of.
Okay.
The bottom line of the word is to turn, but to turn towards something is to face something, to look at something so it can extend itself beyond that.
Okay. So you turn too much and behold little, and come to the house.
When I was hiccup, you brought it in.
Oh, you brought the house and
blow on it.
oh, and I blow it.
Right, blow on it.
A blow on it. Because of what declares Yahweh of hosts.
Yeah, there's an initial statement right there of that cause, that reason, real clear. And so this initial statement was just carried, and you notice the word, Yahweh there. So he's going to pick that up in the very next step twice, right? So there's absolutely no question as to what the issue is here, but go ahead.
So because my house, which it was desolate, and you each go out to his house.
And running, roots.
Oh, running, yeah.
Running. And the participle, so the idea is movement, the idea is activity.
Okay.
You are running each person to his own house. So it's kind of a different kind of movement to that verse there. Now,
because of this,
or, yeah, right, because of this, or therefore, right. So that becomes a kind of equivalent to law Cain in this instance.
okay.
Yeah.
Because of you, the heavens withheld dew, and the ground withheld its produce.
Yeah, right. And it's very clear covenantal statement there, isn't it? I mean that's exactly what it says in Deuteronomy. It's almost pulled right out there. Because God had said, you break my law and this will happen, right? Well, that's specific terminology, so there's no question about it. I mean, it gets extended by that in verse 11 a little bit.
And I called desolation upon the land and upon the hills and upon the wheat and upon the... See, there's a bunch of words I had to look up here. There's new wine and olive oil.
Ripple.
And what's that?
Red boxes turn for ripple and new wine.
Oh, okay. So I don't remember exactly what word they were in.
Tyros is the new wine.
Okay.
And Yitzhar would be oil. Fresh oil.
Okay, and upon the oil, and upon that which goes forth on the earth.
Yeah, it comes out of the ground. Yeah.
Okay. And upon the ground, upon the man, and upon the cattle, and upon all
you can see the breakout pretty clearly, I think, in this chapter. You can see the introduction. Clearly the introduction is there. You got the body, which is introduced there by it says, a question that's raised, right? You say, actually, it's kind of he's making the statement, but it's almost like a question. You say, where am I? You were saying, this people have said, it's not time to build a house of Yahweh, or for the house of Yahweh to be rebuilt, right? But then the question in verse 4, is it time for you? There's a question there, right? Is it time for you, yourselves, emphasis there, to dwell in your paneled houses, in this house that will remain desolate, right? And so the house is desolate. There's another element that occurs, that word that occurs there. The house is desolate, and the terminology reappearing later on in the judgment about they're desolate. The land's desolate, you're desolate. Okay. So the one transfers into the other, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So
that's why I picked desolate in my translation, because it worked for both. And I think BDB's favorite was dry or withered or something like that. But I couldn't have a picture of a withered building.
Right. That's one of the key words running through there to tie the two together. Very good. And then we have of course, the obvious response that he's looking for is repentance here. We have a very clear cause as to this reason for this. There's no question about that. Why is this? Well, because of my house which lies desolate. That's why this is occurring. Therefore, it all came there at that point where verse 10, very, very clear as to the fact that you're experiencing these troubles, right? Because of this, you experience these troubles, right? And it's clear, and he expands upon that all the way from, the beast of the field, the man, the people, the grain, the wine, everything you grow, the work of your hands in every sense, it's just, you're not prospering. Why are you not prospering? Because you ignored my honor by ignoring this house. In favor of your own houses, if you will. So I think it's a very clear kind of statement here of judgment. Okay? Then just looking at how much time we got?
14.
Oh, okay. Just looking at the end of this chapter, how it carries on from here. And Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, the son of Jehoshaphat, the high priest, and all the remnants of the people obeyed, that would be the Shema plus the great one. Obeyed the voice of Yahweh their God, based upon the words of Haggai the prophet as Yahweh, or prophets, because Yahweh had sent, their God had sent him, and people feared from the presence of before Yahweh, especially the messenger. So the response, here's an example where you said before that oftentimes you don't get any statement of the response of the people. Here is a clear statement of the response. They exercised fear before the Lord. Okay? And then Haggai, the messenger of Yahweh, says in the message of Yahweh to the people, saying, I am with you, is a solemn declaration of Yahweh. Right? So, in this case, it becomes a statement of we're not entering into the promise or the deliverance side of the thing here. Right? Seems to be pretty clear. And Yahweh is active in that. He stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, the governor of Judah and the spirit of Joshua, the son of Jehoshaphat, the high priest, and the spirit of all the remnant of the people. And they came and they did work in the house of Yahweh, the host their God. Right? The 24th day of the month, 6th month, 2nd year of Darius the king. So at any rate, we get some indications at that point, even though it doesn't say here that all of a sudden their crops from fruit, egg fruit, and everything changed. The implication is God is pleased with it here, and He worked in their life, and they're going to do the work, and the implication there is the promise will be fulfilled, but there's a blessing side. As the curse, He was faithful in the curse side, and He spelled that out, so the blessing side will be faithful. Right? So that's a development, if you will, off of the whole concepts of both judgment and blessing, even though the blessing isn't spelled out in a specific, which is the objective sense, goes there. Well, there's a number of things. This is all poetry. Well, I should say not all, but verses 2 or 3 down to 11 is all poetry. So, as well, so even though the poetry aspect would be something that were we to really exegete the passage in its full form, if you will, in all its aspects, we would also have to look at the poetic dimensions of this, which we won't get into until tomorrow at some point when we get Hymnic literature, and spend quite a bit of time on Hymnic literature. Okay, good. It's not too hard to read, was it?
No.
It's not hard. It's pretty easy to go through. 4 messages in a small book. Okay, any questions on it? As far as we're going to go tonight. Tomorrow we'll do a little more with the Haggai, more and the specific things of what we do, but then we're going to have to move on to the other kind of literature to finish this course up. So we got 7 hours to do it, so 6 or 7.